thank you, Bob, for the introduction, and thank you all for inviting me here. I'm excited to talk to you guys about horseshoe crabs and some of the work that we're doing here at SCDNR. I know it's a little interesting to be talking about horseshoe crabs when you're a birding group, but you guys, as Bob talked about with the connection, we'll be able to see that through the presentation. Should I just use that? Is maybe that easier?
That should be better than I just turned it down.
Is it working okay? Oh, yeah, it is. So before I begin, I just want to give some acknowledgments to the numerous people that were important in the work that I'm going to be showing you today for research that was done at SCDNR. This doesn't cover everybody, but I'm a member of the crustacean research and monitoring section at SCDNR. So we work with shrimp, blue crabs, horseshoe crabs, even though they're not crustaceans, among other animals. And so it's a very large group. We have a lot of people that help us with this work, and so none of the stuff that I'm showing you today is done just by me. It's an entire group effort. So I'm just going to start off by talking a little bit about the background of horseshoe crabs, where they live, what they are, all those sorts of things, because, well, you all are birders, right? And so you probably know of horseshoe crabs, but I thought it'd be good to give you some background just about them in general. So sometimes you'll hear horseshoe crabs be called a living fossil. You'll see this in publications, a lot of these sorts of things. And the reason people will say that sometimes is because they have fossils going back hundreds of millions of years that look very much like what we have today. So this fossil here on the right is actually about 120 million years old. And if you saw that animal now, you would immediately know that's a horseshoe crab, right? I mean, it looks pretty similar to what we have. That doesn't actually mean that they're not evolving or any of those things. They have been evolving, but structurally they look very similar to how they've looked for hundreds of millions of years. But interestingly, even though we call them horseshoe crabs, they are not actually crabs. So there's been a lot of back and forth in the literature recently about what horseshoe crabs, what they are most related to. I mean, we know they're related to spiders and scorpions. And recent studies have actually said that they themselves are arachnids, but though that is somewhat still debated. And so even though they're called a crab, they're not actually related to what we think of like a blue crab or those sorts of things, not very closely at least. Currently there are four species of horseshoe crabs in the world. 3 of those species live in Eastern Asia, and there's only the one species that we have here in South Carolina and on the Atlantic coast. When you go back to the fossil record, actually, just as a side note, this fossil here was actually found in Germany. And so there are no horseshoe crabs that live in Europe that are found in Europe, but of course, hundreds of millions of years ago, the land masses were very different and organized very differently. And so you'll see horseshoe crab fossils, a lot of them are found in Europe where they don't actually exist anymore. So the horseshoe crab that we have here is called the American horseshoe crab or the Atlantic horseshoe crab, and its scientific name is Limulus polyphemus. And as I showed you on that other map, they have a broad distribution here in the United States on the Atlantic coast. They range from the Gulf all the way up to Maine, and we have populations in the Yucatan along Mexico. And probably they're most well known for their populations in Delaware Bay. So for those of you that know about red knots, you know about the connection of horseshoe crabs with red knots. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But Delaware Bay is often talked about as the spot for the red knots on their migratory route. And that's because there's an estimated 25 to 35 million horseshoe crabs that live in Delaware Bay. But that doesn't mean we don't have a lot down here, right? It's a lot harder for us to get population estimates in South Carolina or Georgia and North Carolina. But I think we have a pretty good sized population as well. The reason why you see things like this in Delaware is because of the limited beaches in the bay and so many horseshoe crabs. They all come together because of the timing of their spawning and have these huge, massive spawning events. And that is what really brings the red knots in, because you have so many eggs on the surface of the sand. So just to give you some basics of a horseshoe crab life cycle, when females will come up with an attached male, and I'll talk about this in a little bit as well, and they lay eggs into the sediment in the sand. It's usually 10 to 20 centimeters deep into the sediment. And those eggs look like this. And as they're maturing, if you get a close-up look, you'll see them. They look like little mini horseshoe crabs in the eggs. They will remain in the sediment for 2 to 4 weeks-ish, depending on the temperature that is in the sediment. And at that point, they'll molt into these little juveniles. And if you go out to the beaches here, sometimes you can see these little trails in the sand. And if you follow those trails to the end, oftentimes you can find a little mini horseshoe crab, a juvenile horseshoe crab. And they take a long time to reach adulthood. We think it's probably between 8 to 10 years until they become adults. And then they can live for about another 10 years as adults. So the horseshoe crabs that you see coming up to the beaches to spawn are between 10 and 20 years old generally. So they're really long-lived. So here is a video I took a few years ago, just so you can see what it looks like, this molting process. This was down in Florida, a horseshoe crab that we had spawned in the lab, and we raised some for a while, and so I took a time-lapse video of one of them molting so you can see what that molting process looks like. I apologize for the quality of the video. It was an old iPhone. So what it's doing is it blows up, and then it does a little wiggle and loses that carapace. And so each time that they molt, they grow about 30% larger. And so you can imagine if you start out as like this big, like they do, how many times it takes to molt to get the horseshoe crabs that we have here that are this big, right? So that's why it takes them a long time to reach adulthood. Interestingly, in other parts of the United States, up in Maine, for instance, they're a lot smaller than they are here, maybe like this big. And it's still not quite certain if that means that they had fewer molts before they reached adulthood, or if there's something like in the food that they eat that makes them so they don't grow as much between molts. But there's a really interesting population differences you see in horseshoe crabs along the Atlantic coast. So horseshoe crabs have a lot of different ecological importance, one of the reasons why we care about horseshoe crabs. So when they come up to the beach or the sediment, wherever they come to spawn, as I said, the females will dig down into the sediment 10 to 20 centimeters. One of the things that does is bring up a lot of nutrients to the surface that would have been buried into the sand. And so there have been studies that have shown when you have these large spawning events, they actually increase the biodiversity and the biomass of the other organisms living in those coastal areas because of all the nutrients that they bring up into the sand. So this is called bioturbation, and is one of the reasons horseshoe crabs are pretty ecologically important. Of course, they also are eaten by a lot of things. So when they're juveniles, a lot of fish and other things will just devour them. But you even get things like alligators that love to eat horseshoe crabs that can make up a good part of their diet. Even though we often think of alligators as more freshwater, they will go out into the saltier waters and get horseshoe crabs. And interestingly, certain sea turtles, when they're juveniles, especially horseshoe crabs, make up a large portion of their diet, like loggerhead turtles and Kemp Ridley turtles. So this is a video, it's very bad, I apologize, but it's the best one I've ever gotten, of a sea turtle eating a horseshoe crab that I took on Parris Island, if you know Parris Island, a couple of years ago. And so you'll be able to see it a little bit, but you can see the horseshoe crab up in its mouth there, you can see the flippers flapping, and then you can see, as it drops it, it's the head of the sea turtle. And so they will just go around, because horseshoe crabs are at the bottom, and just grab them and bring them up and eat under the undersides of the horseshoe crabs. And of course, one of the reasons why I've been invited here, and one of the reasons you guys are here, is because of the importance of horseshoe crabs to a lot of shorebirds, especially migratory shorebirds, which really devour the eggs. They're super highly nutritious, these eggs. And so you get these big events where birds will be migrating and going to places where horseshoe crabs have laid a lot of eggs. And I'm going to go into that in more detail in a bit. So here in South Carolina, we do, as I said, have what we think is a pretty healthy, robust population of horseshoe crabs. And so this is just a general map of the coast of South Carolina with areas of known spawning, areas where we know that horseshoe crabs spawn in some decent abundances. And interestingly, you may notice on this map that really most of it is down in the southern parts of the state. So we have the Ace Basin here. We have in Port Royal Sound where Parris Island and Hilton Head is, and then we have around Turtle Island, which some of you may know of because of all the birds and the birds that go to Turtle Island. But once you get north of, say, Bulls Bay area, we don't have a lot of spawning horseshoe crabs, or at least we don't see them in the numbers that we see them in other places. And one of the things you may know about horseshoe crabs in South Carolina is that they're also used in the biomedical industry. And so this has been going on for a few decades here in South Carolina. And how it works is that they collect horseshoe crabs that come up to spawn. They bring them to the laboratories where they take about a third of their blood, and then they release the horseshoe crabs back into the water. And they're doing this because there's an amoeba site, there's something called an amoeba site in the blood of horseshoe crabs that is super sensitive to being able to detect what's called endotoxins, basically bacteria, the presence of bacteria. And so using their blood, they create something called Limulus amoebocyte lysate, and that is a substance that is tested for the sterility of most medical injectables or devices that are put in your body. So anyone that's had a vaccine or has been given a shot, that the sterility of that has probably been tested against this product made from horseshoe crab blood. And so it's in South Carolina, it's a decent part of the economics of horseshoe crabs. As I said, they can only collect them when they come up to spawn. So in other states, they do it different ways. In some states, there are bait fisheries for horseshoe crabs. They'll use them for the conch and eel bait, and then they'll go out in big boats and trawl to pick up horseshoe crabs, but that doesn't happen here in South Carolina. This is the only fishery for horseshoe crabs. So I'm going to talk to you about two different aspects of research that we have been doing at SCDNR. Because you are ostensibly here because you're interested about birds, the first part of this talk is going to be about some of the work we have been doing looking at this connection between horseshoe crabs and shorebirds here in South Carolina. And then in the second part, I'll talk about some work that we've been doing looking at horseshoe crabs spawning in Spartina salt marsh habitats, not just beach habitats. So I told you, we mentioned a little bit about the use of horseshoe crab eggs by shorebirds. So one of the things that we're really interested in is in South Carolina, how often are these shorebirds using horseshoe crab eggs as fuel for their migration? What we know is that, as I said, in Delaware Bay, it's a hot spot that we think of as a big place for red knots especially. But what happens is when you have large aggregations of horseshoe crabs all spawning on a beach, they put up the sediment because the females have to dig down. And what happens is you'll get females digging up the nests of other females. And so you'll get on these beaches, once you've had these large spawning aggregations, just eggs strewn along the beach. And this is just like a buffet for birds, right? You have these highly nutritious, densely packed eggs that they will go out and eat, tons of. There's one study that showed in Delaware Bay, one red knot can eat 10 to 20,000 horseshoe crab eggs a day. So it's a lot, right? And so you can imagine these birds that are flying up to the Arctic, say, to breed, they need to get a lot of fuel and they need to build up their fat stores quickly. And so horseshoe crab eggs are a great resource to do that. So again, the red knot that we've been talking about, you'll see a lot of these sort of diagrams showing the migration patterns of red knots. So they come from Tierra del Fuego, some of them, and then stop over in Delaware Bay to feast on horseshoe crab eggs for a few weeks. They'll gain a huge percentage of their body weight over those few weeks that they're in Delaware Bay, and then they'll move on to their breeding grounds into Arctic, where they then nest, and afterwards they fly back down to Tierra del Fuego. So this is a massive migration, I mean thousands of miles that they have to go, which explains why they need all this fuel to be able to reach these areas. And so this is just one picture from the Delaware Bay of these horseshoe crabs spawning, and just, there are probably thousands of red knots here on the beach just eating horseshoe crab eggs. But one of the questions we were interested in is how important are horseshoe crab eggs to these shorebirds in South Carolina? You know, there've been tons of studies about their importance for them in Delaware Bay, but we don't know how much they're eating them here in South Carolina. And so this is one of the things we are really interested in trying to get at in some of our research that we've been doing. Now, shorebirds, including red knots, have a variety of things that they'll eat, right? They have the donut clams that they like to eat. They're amphipods, they're these worms, polychaete worms that they would eat. And so there is a variety of things that they might be able to build up their fuel stores with for their migration. And so again, our question was, well, are they really eating a lot of horseshoe crab eggs here? And so there have been some recent research by other folks at SCDNR. I think Felicia Sanders is someone that has given talks here before, and Janet, looking at red knots here in South Carolina. And as Bob said, there's a high percentage of them that we're realizing actually will stop at some point here in South Carolina before going up to their breeding ground. And some of the work that they have done has shown that these red knots that they tag here in South Carolina, a lot of them don't actually stop in Delaware Bay. They go straight from South Carolina up into the Arctic, right? So they're getting most of their fuel here without needing that secondary stop in Delaware Bay, where we know that there are massive amount of horseshoe crab eggs. But we don't know that the thing that's been really interesting with this red knot horseshoe crab connection is that their cues are different for each other. So the cues for these red knot migrations is the day-night cycle, right? As the days get longer, that signifies their cue. That's how they know when they need to leave Tierra del Fuego and start their migratory route. And so that is a cue that's very ingrained, that doesn't change year to year or decade to decade, because that always stays the same. But horseshoe crabs' cues for spawning is not on the day-night cycle. It's not the amount of day length that has happened. It's water temperature. And so horseshoe crabs generally come to spawn once the water temperatures have reached about 16 degrees centigrade or 60-ish degrees Fahrenheit. And so once it's been that temperature for about 2 weeks, that's when you start seeing horseshoe crabs come up to spawn. And so you might imagine that if water temperatures start getting warmer earlier in the year and horseshoe crabs start spawning earlier in the year, you might start to get what's called a mismatch between when the red knots are there and when the horseshoe crabs are spawning. And they've shown some of this already in Delaware Bay. And some years it happens that the red knots and the horseshoe crabs don't match up exactly because of the timing of each of their spawning and migration differ from each other. What's driving the timing of that differs from each other. And so we wanted to get at this sort of at a very basic level to look at both the timing of horseshoe crab spawning here in South Carolina and how that matches with the timing of the red knots that we see here, or all shorebirds that we see here in South Carolina. And so this is work we've been doing for the last 2 years. We're doing it again this year, so we have multiple years of data to look at. And it's been conducted on Turtle Island, which is right near the border with Savannah, but is a place that is known, one, for lots of horseshoe crab spawning, and also known for a lot of shorebirds that stop and feed on Turtle Island. It's a really, really cool place. I think Fletcher came and gave a talk here. I think at some point he does a lot of work on the birds and the horseshoe crabs in this area as well. And so the easy way, we've developed something called an egg survey that we use for the horseshoe crabs to get at the timing of spawning. And basically what we've done is set up 2 transects along the shore of Turtle Island. And we dig using these cores, these mud augers. We dig down into the sand, lift them up, and then sieve and look for horseshoe crab eggs. And we do this across all of these points along the beach. And we do this every 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks from about late March until early July, we are coming out here and looking to see how many horseshoe crab eggs are we finding. And that gives us a really good sense of the timing of when the big spawning events are happening on Turtle Island. But of course, that's only one piece of the picture. The other thing we need to know is when are the birds there? So to do that, I can actually show you. We set up game cameras that took pictures every 10 minutes of those areas where we're doing the transects for the horseshoe crab eggs. And then we have someone, fortunately not me, that looks through all those pictures and counts all of the shorebirds seen in these photos. And they do this on a daily basis, so they pick the picture that has the most number of shorebirds and then counts those shorebirds. If they can identify the shorebird, they try to, but some of these pictures are pretty grainy, and so you can't always identify the shorebird. But from that, we have this really good data set of day-to-day how many shorebirds are at least on the transects where we are doing these horseshoe crab egg surveys. And so the question is, does when we see the most shorebirds actually line up to when we know that horseshoe crab eggs are there? There's two other parts of this project that is going on, and we don't have data on those parts yet, so I can't share that, unfortunately. But along with us, when we're out there doing these transects and digging for horseshoe crab eggs, we have members of SCDNR's genetics team that comes out, and they're collecting bird poop, basically, fecal samples that they find along the beach. And then they're using genetics to look at for the presence of horseshoe crab DNA in the bird poop. And so that is another level of evidence of whether these birds are eating horseshoe crab eggs. Unfortunately, we don't know who pooped, right? There are a lot of birds out there. And so they're collecting a whole suite of fecal samples, and then we can also use the genetics to say what bird that came from, because you can look at what bird's DNA is in that fecal samples. The other aspect of this study, which we also don't have results on, is we're doing nutritional comparisons of all these various prey items that these shorebirds may feed on. So you can figure out how much fat and lipids and carbohydrates or cholesterol, whatever, all of these different animals that the shorebirds eat. And so we can compare them and know, well, how much more nutritious is like one horseshoe crab egg versus one amphipod or something like that. So we can really get a good sense of the importance of these different prey items to the diets of these shorebirds. So I'm going to show you just some preliminary results that we have. Again, this has gone on for 2 years now, and we're doing it again a third year this year. And so in 2023 and 2024, what you see here on the bottom on the x-axis is over time, and on the y-axis is a percent of those augers where we dug down in the sand, what percent of those had horseshoe crab eggs in them. And that gives us a pretty good sense of when was the big spawning events happening on Turtle Island. And what you can see is across the 2 years, they're both actually very similar from each other. So in 2023, the peak of spawning, or when we found eggs, was May 30th, suggesting they probably spawned the week or so before we were out there. And in 2024, last year, it was May 29th. So they're actually very, very similar to each other, which is a little bit surprising because the water temperatures were slightly different, but they've been pretty consistent over the first 2 years that we've been doing this study. And if we look at the birds, we see something pretty different. So in 2023, the peak of birds on Turtle Islands, on shorebirds, was at the beginning of May. And so this is before we had really a lot of horseshoe crab eggs on the beach on Turtle Island. And what we see in 2024, sorry, that was 2023. In 2024, we see it on May 18th, so it's shifted a bit closer to when the mass spawnings of horseshoe crabs has happened on Turtle Island. But again, it's a good bit before we see most of the eggs. Now, there is a little bit of a caveat here, so you may notice that we don't have any data points between late April and mid to late May. And that's unfortunately because our game cameras that we had out there, someone messed with them and took the memory cards and broke them, so we weren't able to get data for those few weeks. We have some plans for those contingencies this year if the similar sort of thing happens. But that is unfortunate because it may have affected when we would see the most birds, of course, because we don't know what was going on exactly when that peak was the year before. We don't have data from that time. But this does show that these shorebirds, now it's not just red knots again that we're counting, it's all shorebirds, that the majority of them were there before the horseshoe crab eggs were there in mass. And really, when we see a lot of horseshoe crab eggs, especially in 2023, there are not actually a ton of shorebirds on the beach, which is pretty counterintuitive, opposite of what you might expect to have found. So again, these are all just preliminary results at this point, and hopefully by the end of this upcoming field season, we'll have 3 years of data and we can really start to get at some of this. Plus we'll have the fecal genetic samples and all these other parts that will add to this story a good bit. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, oops, sorry about that, and talk about the use of salt marsh for horseshoe crabs for spawning. So I've told you a little bit about horseshoe crab spawning behavior. What you'll have is a female with a male attached to her. They'll come up on what we generally thought was always the beach, dig down into the sediment and lay their eggs. And those eggs develop for 2 to 4 weeks. And the things that really are important for egg development is the oxygen in the sediment and how often they're getting water and hydrogen sulfide. And, well, they don't want hydrogen sulfide. And so it's thought, there have been some studies that have shown that the horseshoe crabs generally like to lay their eggs around the high tide line on the beach because that's where those conditions are the best. And it's for a long time, for 50, 60, 70 years, that horseshoe crab research has been going on. It's always been suggested that it's only these beach areas that can really support horseshoe crab embryonic development. In fact, I have this quote from this horseshoe crab researcher, one of the preeminent horseshoe crab researchers, who said, "Active salt marsh and peat bank sediments dominate the upper bay shore. These sediments are unsuitable or at best marginal for horseshoe crab reproduction." So this has been the paradigm for decades and decades of horseshoe crab research. But as many of you know, salt marshes are very extensive in South Carolina. In fact, South Carolina has the greatest acreage of salt marshes of any of the states in the Southeast, other than Florida. But if you exclude the Gulf Coast, it probably has more than Florida. And so there's tons and tons of salt marsh habitat here in South Carolina. And so we were interested in understanding if horseshoe crabs might actually be nesting in these salt marshes, because there's much more salt marsh here than we have actual beaches that you would find horseshoe crabs on. So you might ask, well, why would you even think to look there? Well, there are a couple of reasons. So we did a study that in 2019 to 2021, where we went to random areas in the salt marsh and dug around. And actually at some of these we found horseshoe crab eggs, which is one of the reasons that got us really thinking about this, but we didn't know how extensive it was. But also we had heard anecdotal evidence from horseshoe crab harvesters, those that collect them to take to the biomedical industry, that they often got their horseshoe crabs from salt marsh areas. And since they can only collect them when they're coming up onto the sediment to spawn, when they're out of the water, obviously the people that are making money off of this would have the best idea of where they need to go to do this. So that really got us thinking, all right, well, we need to really see what's going on about these salt marshes and if horseshoe crabs are really using this. And so we devised a study to look at this here in South Carolina. And what we did is we found 3 sites where we wanted to test this out. There was Coffin Point in St. Helena Sound. There was Harbor Island in St. Helena Sound, and then also Paris Island, where the Marines are. And at each of these areas, we found a stretch of beach that we knew horseshoe crabs spawned at, and we found a nearby stretch of salt marsh and to be able to compare it to. And we didn't know if horseshoe crabs were in these salt marshes or not, but we wanted to pick areas that were nearby and that were accessible to us that we could get to, because a lot of salt marshes are really as you know, really hard to get to. There's mud that can sink up to your waist. You need a boat, all these sorts of things. So they're really not the easiest, which may be one reason people hadn't looked for horseshoe crabs in the salt marsh, right? Especially when they need to spawn at high tide, which might be at 11 o'clock at night. Most people aren't going to be waiting around in a salt marsh at 11 o'clock at night just to look for horseshoe crab eggs. But we did. And so we did two things to try to get at this. We did spawning surveys, which is where we just walked along either the beach or the marsh with 2 or 3 other people and counted every horseshoe crab that we saw in that area. And then we also did these egg surveys that I talked about that we are doing at Turtle now, but we did this in both the beach and the marsh. We did them on the same days, the same times. So we had one team that would be in the beach and one team that would be at the marsh doing the exact same thing. And so just to give you some quick results, this is, you don't need to worry about the numbers too much, but basically this is how many female horseshoe crabs we saw when doing those spawning surveys, when walking on the beach and in the marsh. And what we found is that there was no difference between the two. Now you may think, oh, well, no difference, that's not very exciting. But actually that means that they are spawning in the beach just as much as they are spawning, they're spawning in the marsh just as much as they're spawning in the beach. So in this case, no difference is actually really exciting and very surprising that this is what we found. And in our egg survey, we actually found more eggs in the marsh than we did in the beach. And so there could be a couple of reasons for this. So one possibility is that they are actually spawning more in the marsh, which certainly is a possibility. You might ask, well, why didn't you see more crabs then? Well, because again, sometimes we're walking in water that's waist high at 11 o'clock at night in the marsh, trying to kick and figure out how many crabs are down there. Or at the beach, you're just walking along a nice beach and you can see a horseshoe crab that's crawling on the beach. But another possibility is that one of the things we found is, like you can see in this picture, the horseshoe crab eggs seem to stay very compact. They will lay them in these balls and these clutches. And in the beach, sometimes those eggs will then move away from each other, but in the dense marsh, they'll sit there in that ball. And so when we found them, we would find a bunch of horseshoe crab eggs. But at the very least, this suggests that they are spawning a lot in the marsh, a lot more than we thought they would. I don't have it up here, but another part of this study is that we picked 50 random points around Edisto area, 50 points in the beach and 50 random, completely random generated points in the marsh to go and dig for horseshoe crab eggs. And we found that it was equally likely that we found horseshoe crab eggs in the marsh than at the beach. So it's really suggestive that they're doing a lot. And one of the cool things about this study is that it wasn't just here in South Carolina that we did this. We had partners that did this in Connecticut and partners that we did this in New Hampshire, and they all found the same thing. So it seems like horseshoe crabs really, it's not just a South Carolina thing. Horseshoe crabs are really using the marsh to spawn. It seems like it's an important habitat for them that was previously not recognized. But the big question is, that quote that I asked you, that I read to you, was, well, these sediments are unsuitable for horseshoe crabs, mainly with the idea of embryonic development, that embryos that are laid in these areas can't develop. So we know now horseshoe crabs are spawning there, but are they actually viable eggs? Are they going to produce offspring that can get out and survive and grow up? And so one of the things that we do here is called staging horseshoe crab eggs. So when we collect eggs, we can preserve them, and then we can look at how far along in development they are. So when you first get a horseshoe crab egg, it looks like this. The coloration is a little weird because we have to preserve them in ethanol, and so that bleeds away some of the color. But when you first get a horseshoe crab egg, you can't see much development going on at all. But as they get older, this is probably after about 2 weeks, you start to see limbs and various things develop. And then by the 4-week stage, they really look almost like a little baby horseshoe crab. So this is what's called, this here is like the trilobite stage, where they're just ready to get out in the water and start doing their thing. And so we can classify this into early, middle, and late stages. So how do you determine whether embryos and eggs are doing well in the marsh? Well, we followed a similar thing as we did before, as we'd go out into the beach and we'd go out into the marsh. We had teams at each, and then we would put flags down where we saw horseshoe crabs were nesting. So yeah, it looks really painful to be out and do our work and get paid to be out at this sort of area, I know. But we walk along and just put flags. You can put flags right near this little hinge of where the female is, and that's generally where she buries her eggs. So we marked those flags, and then 3 weeks later, we came back to the flags and dug them up. And so then we can know, okay, here's the nest, here's the eggs that female laid. Let's stage these eggs. Let's look at the development of these eggs. And so we can directly compare the development of those that were laid 3 weeks ago in the beach and 3 weeks ago in the marsh. And so here's what we found. This is all preliminary results. But this is the percent of embryos that we found in each stage of these clutches. And generally what we see is that we do see that development seems to be happening faster in the beach than in the marsh. They have more of these late stage horseshoe crabs for the nest that we excavated after 3 weeks at the beach. But we're still seeing a lot of development going on in the marsh. It may be going a little bit slower, but they're getting their embryos to this late stage. They're hatching. They're doing all the things they should, even though it's a little bit slower. So this suggests to us that maybe there is a cost of nesting in the marsh and that your development happens more slowly, but it's still happening. And there may be benefits to nesting in the marsh. For example, and one of the things that we're now interested in is whether there are shorebirds that will go to the marsh to eat their eggs, right? So perhaps it takes them longer to develop, but if you don't have these predators coming along and going down into the sediment to pick out all your eggs, maybe it's a viable strategy for horseshoe crabs to be laying in the marsh. And so that's actually a new project that we just got funded for that is starting this year. And what we are going to do, it's twofold. We're first interested in learning what are the marsh conditions that are good for horseshoe crabs. So we're going to go out into the marsh, we're picking random sites, we're digging tons and tons of places to look for eggs, and we're taking a lot of environmental variables to be able to hopefully tease apart, okay, this marsh is good for horseshoe crabs, this marsh is not good. And we think things like vegetative cover might be important. The softness of the mud, right? That real pluff mud, we don't think they like that very, very much. Anecdotally, it was really the firmer sort of marsh that we would find the eggs at. And so that's our first thing, and this is in collaboration with partners in New Hampshire, but also now a partner in Delaware. So we're gonna be able to do this in the Delaware Bay, which we know is really important for red knots and other shorebirds. And no one has looked for horseshoe crabs spawning in the marsh in the Delaware Bay area. So this is going to be the first time to do that, which is pretty exciting. So that's our first year, is finding out which of these areas are good for horseshoe crab nesting and what marsh is good. And then we're setting up, using the whole game camera system again, we're going to set up game cameras in the marsh at these areas where horseshoe crabs nested and where they don't. And so we can look to see if any shorebirds are coming to these areas to eat the eggs. Because it would be really cool if we found some of these shorebirds are coming to the marsh areas where horseshoe crabs are spawning to eat eggs, because that hasn't been shown before. But if they're not coming there, that's also equally cool, because that's a sign that this might be a refuge for these horseshoe crabs. They can nest in the marsh and put their eggs there and not worry about birds eating them. But on a management level, this is also an important thing. So I don't want to get too into the weeds of this, but the take of horseshoe crabs in the Delaware Bay area is managed by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. And it's all, their models are basically made, they allow a harvest up to a certain amount based on what is sustainable for both the horseshoe crabs and the red knots. So they use trawl surveys where they pick up horseshoe crabs in the water to get an estimate of how many horseshoe crabs are there. And then they base that, they say, all right, we need this many horseshoe crabs to be able to lay enough eggs so that red knots will have the eggs so that they can make their migration. But if some large portion of those horseshoe crabs are nesting in the marsh in Delaware Bay and not just at the beach, that suggests that maybe these models aren't taking this into account properly, especially if red knots and other birds aren't going to the marsh to access those eggs. So we're pretty excited about what this project may find. And so with that, I want to thank all of you for taking the time. I hope I didn't bore you too much with the non-bird aspect of this, but I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has. Yeah.
Is there a difference between marsh and beach? When you talk about beach, most people think of it as being a high tide event. Is there tidal spawning in the marsh?
So we don't know the answer. There's so many things we don't know yet. From when we've been out there, as I said, they like to nest on that marsh platform. So after you get over the like sort of ridge that's on there. And so you need a tidal event that's high enough to get onto there for them to access it. But whether after you get to that point, I'm not sure that it matters that much to them. We have been at some of the places that we did this work, there would be water way past us and we would see horseshoe crabs all down in the marsh nesting there. But they do need the tide to be high enough to get to that point where they can access that marsh platform. Yeah.
Do the females lay eggs more than one time every year? And then you mentioned that 16 degrees is when they start, and at the end of May they stop. Is that because the water temperature is higher?
Yeah, so females will lay multiple clutches in a year. Usually we think they lay about 6 or 7 or more clutches. So the horseshoe crabs here in South Carolina are really large, one of the largest that there are, and we think females will lay between around 65,000-ish eggs in a year, and each clutch that they lay has roughly 6,000 to 10,000 eggs. And so they will lay multiple clutches. Oftentimes that's on the same spawning event. They will go up to the beach or the marsh, dig down, lay some eggs, and then a minute or two later, get up and move a foot or so and dig back down and lay it again. But they'll also come back on subsequent nights or high tide events if they haven't finished all their laying. And what was the second question?
The temperature of the water.
Yeah, so there is a maximum temperature. So there have been studies that have shown that eggs and embryos don't develop well once you get above like 30 degrees C, which is pretty warm, but in this, July time period, we will have those sorts of temperatures at time in the sediments especially. And so they stop generally here in mid-June, and it is temperature driven. I think it's temperature driven, and it's driven because all the females that have laid their eggs are done, and so they're off. You'll still find a male occasionally on these hot summer days coming to the beach looking for a female, but they're generally out of luck at that point. Yeah, if you want a quick follow-up.
Yeah, so they go from New Hampshire all the way down here, so is it a similar temperature up there?
It's different actually, which is really interesting. So I was just in a meeting with the collaborator in New Hampshire, and we're trying to figure out the timing of when we want to visit each other to make sure all our methods are the same. And we're hoping maybe we could do this when they're actually horseshoe crabs spawning. But their main spawning time in New Hampshire is actually the same spawning time. It's mid-May as it is here. And the reason is because I think they probably are more cold tolerant in New Hampshire. Now it's not quite the same. Now this is in the Great Bay, so the water temperature is a little different when you get into the bay. I know in Maine, I've done some work up in Maine, and the main spawning there was in mid-June, so it was a little later in some areas because of the water temperatures, but there does seem to be some adaptation to different temperatures about when they'll spawn. Yeah. So a lot of it is just like anything they can get in their mouth that is soft enough for them to chew. So a lot of it is like worms or these polychaetes. Sometimes they'll have some mussels or these other things that they will have eaten, but they really get in the sediment and just kind of root around, and anything that they can get into their mouth and chew, they will eat. We've done, there was some work a fellow person in grad school did looking at some of that stuff, and we'll also get vegetation and all sorts of stuff that's coming out. So they'll eat pretty much anything. Yeah.
What's the general
So the population trends, it's a little bit tricky here in South Carolina. So if you look across the Atlantic coast, this ASMFC, Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission Council, breaks it down by region when they look at the status of horseshoe crabs. And actually here in the Southeast, we've been at a good level, meaning their reference date of 1998, so that's where they go back because that's where regulations were first put in place for horseshoe crabs at the federal level. The regulations compared to 1998 were at or more in our surveys seeing horseshoe crabs. Some places, the area that's being done the worst is in the New York area where they're seeing fewer horseshoe crabs than they did in 1998. But here in the Southeast in general, and in South Carolina is lumped in with Georgia and southern North Carolina, seem like we're doing pretty well, at least based off of our surveys, or at least doing as well as they were in 1998. Yeah.
So we found out last year from the aerial studies done by DNR that all of a sudden the red knots took off and went down to Georgia to eat the horseshoe crab eggs right before they migrated.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so is that a result of the fact that in South Carolina there's not enough spawning going on earlier enough?
It may be. I mean, spawning for horseshoe crabs, as you might expect, because of water temperature, you would expect would start a bit earlier in Georgia than they did in South Carolina, right? As you move further north, it's going to be a bit later. So it could be. Talking with Felicia and Janet, it seems like red knots in particular have this this amazing sense to be able to know where horseshoe crabs have spawned and get to those areas to eat those eggs. How they know this, I don't think anyone has any idea, right? You'll have them roosting on Kiowa, and then they'll all go to one little island and right after the horseshoe crabs are spawned. So it could be that the horseshoe crabs were lined up better, the timing. I mean, Fletcher probably has some of those data and knows some of that stuff. But it is really interesting, right? They seem to know where the horseshoe crab eggs are when they're around.
And why in Kiowa and Seabrook don't we have very many spawning? Is it because of the topography and the tide?
Yeah, likely. It's hard to know exactly what it makes a good spawning area for horseshoe crabs. So one of the things that they don't like are really strong waves and wave action because they can get flipped, and if they get flipped over, they might not be able to right themselves, and that's one of the main sources of mortality as an adult is getting flipped over when you come up to, say, a beach to spawn. I don't actually know how much wave action you guys have here, but it's possible that that is one reason that they don't. So oftentimes you'll find them in these little bay areas where maybe it's a bit calmer, where you don't have as much wave action. We think maybe that's one reason some of them like the marsh, because you don't have those big waves that would flip you over, and there's more vegetation to be able to stay low. There's also, I don't know enough about Kiowa and Seabrook to know how much beach restoration has been done here. None? Okay. Because they sometimes don't. That takes them a while to go back to beaches where there's been a lot of restoration if the sediment type isn't quite the same. But it's really spotty, right? You'll get them in Edisto in decent numbers. You get them at these other beaches that don't seem, just from the eye level, much different. But they also move around a lot. So some years you'll get them in a place, and the next year you won't get them at all, and they'll be somewhere else. So it is interesting that Kiowa and Seabrook don't seem to have a ton of horseshoe crab spawning, but other places nearby do. Yeah.
Do you know if the marsh spawning ones or the beach spawning ones are the same horseshoe crabs, or do they?
That's a question we are very interested to find out. So we did some tagging to try to see if ones that we tagged and say the marsh always came back to the marsh, or those that we tagged on the beach always came back to the beach. But we didn't get enough horseshoe crabs that we recited to be able to say that. We do have some genetics that we have been doing with these to see if there is a difference, if we could tell that genetically. One of the things that is very preliminary now is with that's one of the studies where we were collecting eggs from the marsh and the beach when we, it's a different study I didn't quite talk about, but we were doing some what's called transcriptomics, which is looking at the genetic expression of the embryos in the marsh and the beach. We're interested in maybe if they're laying eggs in the marsh, maybe they did, they're expressing genes that help them survive better in this harsher environment, what we think is a harsher environment in the marsh. But one of the things preliminarily that is coming out of that is that it's actually not where the eggs are developing that we see the difference. We do see some difference there, but the biggest difference is based on where they were coming up to spawn originally. So what we did is take eggs, and we took a male and a female, and we did in vitro fertilization, and we took some of their eggs and we put it in the marsh, and we took some of their eggs and we put it in the beach. And so this was our little experiment to see how things worked out. And genetically, it looks like it doesn't matter where we put the eggs, it matters where we collected the horseshoe crabs that we did the in vitro from, which is really surprising to all of us. We haven't quite worked our heads around what this means. It may suggest that they are different, actually, like genetic animals going to marsh and beach, but we don't know this yet. So that is still an open question. There's a lot left to find out about what's going on when they're spawning in the marsh because it's so new. Yeah.
The blood draw, the blood look blue, what's the oxygen now?
So they actually, it's using copper and not iron, which is why it's blue.
Is there additional mortality after the blood draw?
So there've been a lot of studies about the mortality of the bleeding facilities and what happens. And they've had wildly varying results based on how they did the study. So estimates have ranged from about 2% mortality to up to 30% mortality. This ASMFC that does all the regulations about harvest limits, they looked at all the studies and came up with a 15% mortality estimate, and that's what they use in their statistical models when they're trying to figure out how many horseshoe crabs can be harvested. Whether it's actually 15% or not, it's unclear. There have also been some studies that have shown that when you take some blood and you put them back in the water, they may live, but they may affect them, not surprisingly, for a little bit. So ones that have been returned back to the water after bleeding don't come up to the beach to spawn that same year as much because they're probably recovering. So there may be some what we call sublethal effects from this, but the ASMFC has set that at around 15%. If you talk to the companies, they'll say it's actually much lower than that. Which may be they may be right? So, but we can only go based off all the different studies that are out there. Yeah, Alan.
I have read that, I believe I've read that in Europe they have come up with a chemical solution base to replace the need. Part two of the question, is that true? And part two of the question is, why are the United States not taking that path?
I can answer part one. I can't speak for the United States about what's going on there. There is a synthetic, and a lot of these companies that actually create the limulus amoebicide lysate are also have been working on synthetic products. Europe's pharmacopoeia, which is what regulates what drugs can be used, allowed that to be used, the synthetic to be used just like the LAL that we have. Here in the United States, the synthetic can be used, it's been allowed to be used, but at least up to now, it's required some additional testing by the companies that wanted to use them. So they had to show that it was working as well as the LAL when they were using it. But it does exist, and it may become more and more used in the future.
Since the harvesting has become somewhat controversial, would it be possible to farm raise horseshoe crabs?
They have tried that. The issue is that life cycle. It takes about 10 years to become an adult, which is a long time to keep an animal. And so there have been some studies looking at it. It's pretty hard to get a horseshoe crab to go from egg to adult just because of the length of time and so many things that can go wrong. There has been a group in Greensboro, I believe, North Carolina, that has been working on not farming them, but collecting adults and then keeping them as adults in tanks so that they can bleed them every 2 months or something and let them recover and bleed them rather than going out and collecting the wild ones. I mean, I guess they were wild before they took them into their labs. And so there is work being done on that aspect of it. Yeah.
Just a comment, I'm from Indianapolis, and Eli Lilly is one of the U.S. companies that creates the synthetic
Mhm.
linear but they had to have it deemed the same,
Mhm.
equivalent, sorry.
Mhm.
They had to prove equivalence because all of the FDA approvals of all the injectables have been done on wild Linus
Mhm.
lysate. So, but that occurred, I believe, sometime last fall, if
Mhm.
I'm not mistaken. So, may see more of that.
Yeah, Eli Lilly, if I remember correctly, was one of the first U.S. companies that said we are going to use the synthetic primarily. But they did have to jump through extra hoops when doing that to show all this testing was equivalent to the LAL.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you guys, I appreciate it.